The story behind the story. Grandpa Tom, he grew up amongst sharecroppers, a fancy name he gave to cotton pickers. At least that's how I perceive them to be. Doesn't make me right. They were tenants on someone else's land, possibly paid with a portion of the harvest instead of with money. How much different are we from them if we do not own our land? That's just my own personal introspection. He shined shoes to earn his living because it paid in real coin. He walked by those sharecroppers every day, reminding him that he too would be a sharecropper. He wanted to be a doctor. When he became of age, he went to the military and became a paramedic in war. It was a step, a pivot. Afterwards, or after war, he became a teacher. The same boy who couldn't go to school because he didn't have any shoes. Maybe I could start from the beginning, or at least the beginning of our relationship. I decided that I would write his book. I wanted to learn about my family tree. I think that he knew it would be more he'd share and I'd earn, or he earned and I share. Depends on how you look at it. But it was something called a legacy. Summer after summer, I drove 6 hours to the state line that separates Tennessee from Kentucky. Ask him where he's from, and he will say Kentucky. But I came back to him to get the rest of his story. The whites didn't like him, to say the least. Notice it's the whites. He didn't dwell on racism or his father who suffered from mental illness because his father's father was a slave. I'll say it again. He didn't dwell on racism, the white, or no blacks allowed. His father suffered from mental illness because his father was a slave. My grandfather's grandfather was a slave. The first book I ever read in the first grade was titled To Be a Slave. I was looking for a tree and found a circle. Instead of talking about racism, he told me about swimming in the creek with his friends. He told me about the teacher who gave him shoes so he could come back to school. Both stories made him smile. He told me about a girl he loved that wasn't his wife or my grandmother. She was his before, the first love. She married someone else, someone older. My imagination hurried to fill the gaps of what all that meant to him. He told me about his criminal cases and how to know when an attorney is losing, which I call flailing, yelling, never want to fight. He laughed at loud attorneys. He minimized the fact that he was the first black assistant district attorney. He never showed me a plaque. Instead, we went for a drive so I could see the fields that held stories. We went to the graves of his parents, my great-grandparents, whom I've never met. Their stories, his pain, both a part of my own. So, graduate school. asked guided questions to learn more. How did you go from wanting to be a doctor to becoming a lawyer? He taught me it's important to reach. It's in the reach. He also said, better to be a C student than an A student who lacks common sense. He grew a peach tree. He grew the fruit and would give it away freely. But if you stole from him, you'd see his fury. He was generous. He wore his hair in one long braid. He was proud of me for becoming a writer. At least that's how he knew me. He entrusted me with his story. I wrote it. Nonfiction. Not like that. I had to grow into the writer who could tell the story. My grandpa grew up surrounded by sharecroppers who told him day in and day out all he'd ever be is like what he sees, a sharecropper. He wanted to be a doctor, so he went to war and saw too much, but learned a lot about God, death, life, humanity, and politics. School was a struggle in the beginning because of poverty. How much was it valued? Education and books, after all the ancestors were deprived of it. After all the ancestors deprived of it. No blacks allowed was posted on places we read about but never spoke about. He was hated by many men and misunderstood by his peers. He wanted to become a doctor and he became a lawyer. Never trust a preacher is what he taught me. Never trust a cop. I asked why. He said, because they're both liars. Instead, he showed me his Bible and big guns throughout a small house. Psalm 23 and Amazing Grace were his favorite scripture. In him, he was a warrior with a beautiful singing voice. He sang in the church choir. He told me with a smile. He looked esteemed and proud. I think talking about God reminded him of his mother. How many times did she sing that song or read that scripture? He never said that she did. I asked about his pastor, and he told me about Joe Lewis on the radio. He was kind of funny. He didn't want to talk about preachers and pastors, but the athlete who drew a real crowd. Voices only, no TV. Masters and fathers aside, there was a mother wound. His mother left the house when he was 10 years old and took his siblings along for the journey north. If I take you, he'll come looking for me. So she left him with his father. A gloomy day indeed, but he never used the word abandoned. He told me the facts, not the emotions. His dad worked on the railroad and drank ice water in the heat, in the sun. He laughed, but the coldness gave him heart palpitations, heart problems. He talked about the heart, the organ. Then he shifted to food, the stomach. He told me what it was like when they ate and prepared the whole hog like a feast. He still got excited when he told the story. Can you imagine growing up in poverty, but focusing on the feast? That was Grandpa. He knew what he knew, and he was looking at something that no one else could see. Thomas Laverne Rogers. He said his mother named him after the milkman's wife. The mailman, I asked. They deliver the milk in glass bottles, bring it to the porch. another time, another life. He told me I reminded him of Velma, my grand. He had love in his eyes. He became my dad, my granddad, an example of resiliency. I never really settled on a name for him. Grandpa Tom, Thomas, Papa, not Papa. But the lesson he taught me is you are not what people call you or who they say you are. He made a name for himself. I am a doctor. He used affirmations, rich self-talk at an early age. It's very spiritual and full of faith. Not sure he knew what he was doing. So I was becoming a lawyer, huh? Yeah. Was becoming a lawyer a mistake, a failure? Were you disappointed? I wanted his take on what I considered to be a triumph. He taught me if you reach high enough, you will be happy where you land. He told me stories about the stars and the moon. It may not feel like it's within reach, but the secret is in the reach, the stretch of faith it takes to get there. Many don't get there. He went to school for pre-med, imagine that, at the University of Illinois, Urbana, a town so close to me. He walked right out of class when confronted with racism by his professor. Not really sure if it was the first time, but it was the last time in that town or in that campus. That is how he got his law degree. He walked out of class and ended up in Tennessee. If he hadn't left, he never would have met my grandmother. I saw one photo. They were looking fly, like real model-like. His mother was in it. They were dressed real sharp, like they drove fancy cars, but knew the cost. I came with the cost for both my grands. Grandpa will become a lawyer, a husband, and a dad, 3 in 1, instead of a doctor. My grandmother would leap to marry, only to lose her husband. I saw the photo from perhaps a honeymoon. They were visiting San Antonio, Texas. By the time my mother was 2 years old, he stayed away too long at school, and Grandmama felt like he'd left his family. If I have to do this on my own, the infamous words, these infamous words spoken by countless strong Black women. Did you leave, Grandmama? He answered me in legal terms, no contest. There were times to fight, times to remain neutral, and definitely times to walk away. There was a time for grace and a time for war, a time for a rifle and a time for a prayer. One thing I know about Grandpa, he wasn't trading his dream for anything. Deemed best to grab his firearm and pray later, he put a blade in my hand. Hold it to see if it fits in your palm. He approved it. That was our little version of Psalm, just between us, a little secret. There was a story behind his story, history. Slave to sharecropper, still working the land for free. First whites against blacks, then blacks against blacks. The pulpit was used for controlling abuse of power. Freedom was found in books and voting, but you could do neither without your shoes. Whose shoes are you wearing? He showed me his father. He showed me his grandfather, a slave. His son, my grandfather's father, was not a slave, nor was he completely free. The mental illness that slavery created is under-discussed and riddled with shame. Still, shame. The children were no longer taken by the master. They had to flee with their mothers, while others were left to endure more abuse from their fathers. He spoke on it with few words. "I'll come back for you," his mother told him, but the years went by. It was just me reading between the lines one hot summer after the next. He showed me my own story with my father, with my daughter. He showed me the worth of my English degree, one pointing finger, the Bible, and fields where all they knew, only one was allowed. I learned of my grandfather, 6 hours of driving, more listening than writing, and I understood my grandmother's sorrow, which she never discussed. There's a grief that goes down into the soul that silences you. There's much to say, but all of it unspeakable. I learned about my father through the eyes of a man who despised him, the despicable preacher. They say lawyers are the biggest liars, but he say no, it's the cops and the preachers. One incarcerates the body and the other the mind, but both are thieves of freedom. What Grandpa calls a liar, I call a thief. He never used the word system, but systems are what I see just underneath the story behind the story. He chose politics to accomplish change. Great thinker. I chose theology as a vehicle for my giftings. In God we trust. Neither of us did it for the money. He chose that state line, and I'm not too far from Urbana, the town he had enough of due to racism. The schemes, their schemes, made it impossible. Evil itself is a spirit. No spirit stays in one body forever. They shift and fly all about and abide in schools and prisons, politicians, lawyers, judges, pulpits, and congregations. Having hate causes one to hate good and love evil. Grandpa Tom was up to something. He knew of staying power. If they want to leave, no contest. He married my grandmother, a teacher, who later became counselor. His second wife, a librarian. They stayed married over 40 years. Till death do we part. But Granddad, I may never tell the story just the way you like it, but it's a story I will tell in different ways, sharing new parts. But death and my heart ain't got nothing in common. You are near to me in the farness, hearty laugh still shaking your head, amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. If you know of love, drove with it in the car, stood over graves and beside the peach tree, heard stories of swimming in the creek, could see a fight from listening on a radio. How could you not tell of it? P.S. Mom may or may not have your guns. I can neither confirm nor deny. I do not know. I do not recall. Resume or eulogy. The story behind the story. One tree, one pair of shoes, and a key. Through hell and death, love and war. You can't drop a key you're not carrying. With that a breath, I take a breath and know a little bit more of God's goodness.